Have with us today in our Geography and Spatial Science seminar series Professor Robert Hazen, who is the Executive Director of the Deep Carbon Observatory at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, and also the Clarence Robinson Professor Emeritus of Earth Science at George Mason University. We're also delighted that he is joined today by Margaret Hindle Hazen, who is a collaborator in both life and profession, and they have even authored a book together, which they have very kindly autographed for me, published by Princeton University Press, called Keepers of the Flame, the Role of Fire in American Culture. But we're not going to talk about the book, but we do have also Margaret Hindle Hazen with us in case any of you would later want to connect. And she's working on a fascinating new novel also. So it's fiction, non-fiction, the whole works. There's a very gifted, talented couple we're blessed to have with us today. But today, the topic of the presentation is Professor Hazen's book, Symphony in C, which is a marvelous tribute to carbon. And it's, my first degree was in chemistry, and so I love books on the elements more generally, but carbon particularly is so seminal to existence that it's really befitting that he chose a title also, which is one that transcends just science and goes into the arts and the humanities. And that brings me to another aspect of Professor Hazen's persona, which is that he's a musician and an accomplished one, a trumpet player for 30 plus years, and he actually has performed in places like the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and also it's not just a side hobby. So we're really thrilled that he's with us here in all these multiple capacities. Just a little bit on his bio further. So Professor Hazen was trained in earth science at MIT. He did his undergraduate degree at MIT. And then he did his PhD in mineralogy and crystallography at Harvard. Then subsequently he has worked in various institutions, but I should mention that his work especially is relevant to current kind of astrobiology efforts as well. It's not just on planet Earth, but beyond as well. And just very recently, so prolific that some of his proteges are now publishing in these sort of broad domains of talking about what are the fundamental sort of laws of nature. And there was a paper that he and one of his postdocs just published in the Proceedings of the National Academies a few weeks ago that I saw that he may also refer to today, that talks about potentially going beyond this kind of law of entropy, and also his scholarship covers such a broad range of intellectual inquiry that it's really such a treat to have him with us. And he's, in terms of his other accolades that I should mention, he's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's the recipient of the Roebling Medal, which is the highest honor given by the Mineralogical Society of America. And he is also involved in now a series of efforts around public sort of education around science and geoscience, and he may want to also talk about that because that's another area that we're trying to do much more of at UD. So without further ado, it's a real pleasure and honor to have Professor Hazen with us. So over to you, Professor Hazen.
Thank you, Salim, and thank you so much for being here today. As Professor Ali alluded to, there's no element that's more fundamental in our lives than carbon. It's an element of living things. It's the element that's most important in terms of the changing character of our atmosphere. It's an element that's also profoundly important in the field of mineralogy. And so there's a bit of a bait and switch today, because while I'm going to be alluding to carbon throughout this talk, I also want to step back from carbon, indeed any one individual element or even the mineral kingdom itself, and think about what are some of the most fundamental laws of nature which lead to minerals, which lead to the chemical elements, which lead to life itself. And my colleagues and I think that there's a missing law. But in order to give you an understanding of the journey that has taken us over the last 15 years to this realization, I want to first talk about a field called mineral evolution. So, when we think about mineral evolution, let me make sure this is advancing. There we go. We think about the importance of mineralogy itself. And you're all aware of this, that minerals provide the essential raw materials for all of the activities around us. Almost everything in this room came in one sense or another from the mineral world. It's also an incredibly important way to understand other planets and our place not only within the solar system, but within our galaxy, within the cosmos. Minerals have, for more than 2 centuries, provided the fundamental basis for discoveries in physics and chemistry. The periodic table of the elements came from a mineralogist. The discovery of X-ray diffraction came once again from the study of minerals. So these are important. And they're also astonishingly beautiful. When you look at these pictures of minerals, most of which are carbon-bearing minerals, because carbon's everywhere, we see how beautiful they are. So a point that I want to make throughout this presentation is that minerals are terribly important in understanding who we are and where we came from. They're the oldest things you can hold in your hand. They tell stories of the origin and evolution of planets, of life, and every specimen, I think of every specimen as a time capsule. If you go to the beautiful Mineral Museum here on campus, just a couple doors down, you'll see fabulous specimens, and every one of those tells a story. It's ancient, in some cases hundreds of millions or even billions of years old, and it holds secrets about our planet's past. So the key to understanding the coevolution of Earth and life is this emerging field called mineral evolution. The idea was introduced in a paper in 2008 in American Mineralogist, and this is sort of part one of our journey to try to understand the evolution of all kinds of systems in the natural world. Originally, this is very qualitative. Mineral evolution is the study of the changing diversity and the distribution of minerals as a consequence of changes in environmental conditions. The physical conditions, the chemical conditions, and ultimately on Earth, the biological processes that planets produce. If you're not familiar, minerals, we have a special name for a mineral species. That's a kind of mineral, and every mineral species has 3 criteria. It's a naturally occurring solid. It has to have an idealized composition like SiO2, that's quartz in this case, and it has to have its idealized crystal structure. And every unique combination of a structure and a composition is called a mineral species. And right now there are about 6,000 approved species by the International Mineralogical Association. Now, in mineral evolution, we look at the change in the diversity of species, the relative abundances of those species. We think about compositional ranges of minerals, including the trace and minor elements, not just the major elements, and also just things like the size and shape. When you see a crystal, what is it telling you about its past? We focus exclusively on the near-surface environment in our work, but you could project much, much deeper into a planet if you wanted to. But that's because that's what's accessible on Earth. That's what we can study easily or with drill cores. We can observe this on other planets and moons, and it's where you're most likely to get interactions with biology, which plays a huge role in Earth's mineral evolution. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot this evening about evolution as a process. And some people have criticized this. So you can't talk about mineral evolutions. Minerals don't evolve. And I disagree. The word evolution has lots of meanings. The most basic one is change over time. And minerals on Earth have certainly changed through time. It also means that there's an implication of complexification. You go from simpler to more diverse. You'll see that for minerals this is certainly true. And also something called congruency, which means that each stage of mineral evolution follows logically what came before, and so you're going step by step through a process. Planets do this. But it's not this. It's not Darwinian evolution. It's not common descent, so remove that from your mind. That's a different kind of evolution, as we'll see later on. So the idea here, the key idea is that new minerals form through a combination of new chemical, physical, and biological processes. And we talk about 10 stages of mineral evolution. We talk about the change in the mineralogy of a planet going through a sequence of steps, and Earth has gone through 10 of these. Actually 11 if you consider the minerals first. So here's this timeline of the different stages. There's lots of papers now that describe these. We begin with the minerals. These are stellar minerals. Before there ever was a solar system, mineral grains were forming around active stars. And in the atmospheres of those stars, as they expanded and cooled, especially in the late stages or sometimes in the explosion of a supernova, you had cooling atmospheres that are rich in silicon and nitrogen and oxygen and magnesium and some other elements. You form this dozen or so different kinds of minerals from 12 different chemical elements. And so the core question of mineral evolution is, how do you get from about 20 different mineral species with 12 essential elements before the solar system began to what we see today, which is about 6,000 minerals with 72 different essential elements. The different stages, and I'm going to go through these very, very quickly because you can certainly read more about them, but the earliest stage is when the solar system first began. You started condensing phases out of that very, very hot nebular material. This gets you about 90 mineral species that are preserved in what are called chondrite meteorites. Then the achondrite meteorites, which happen when you form a planetesimal, 50 or 100 kilometers in diameter, you start to melt, you form a metallic-rich core, you form a mantle of silicates, many more minerals form, you have aqueous alteration, you have thermal alteration, you have impact alteration with other bodies colliding together. This gets you up to roughly 300 different minerals. Those are the things we find in meteorites that fall to Earth today. And we think that that may be about the entire mineral inventory of a dry planet like the moon. Perhaps Mercury is like this as well, about 300 different mineral species. But if you have a wet planet like Earth, like Mars, then you can start forming other minerals, hydroxides and clay minerals, ices at the poles and so forth. And so we think Mars may have gotten up to this point, about 450 different minerals. That's stage 3. Earth does other things. It has granite formation, which gives you about 1,000 different minerals from complex pegmatites, beautiful minerals that you can go and see at the Mineral Museum here on campus. Stage 5, plate tectonics, gives you even more fluid rock interactions. You form different kinds of volcanism with new minerals. You form massive base metal deposits with new kinds of minerals. You basically have mountain building, bringing high pressure rocks to the surface and giving you even more minerals and getting you up to about 3,000 species in all through the first 5 stages of mineral evolution. But if you paid attention, there are now about 6,000 minerals. So how do you get from 3,000 to 6,000? We sort of scratched our heads and it suddenly came to us, whoa, the answer is life. Life plays a huge role in the origin of minerals on Earth's surface. Stage 6, this is just to show you that there's all different sorts of ways that minerals played a role in the origin of life. So there's a kind of feedback here, coevolution of the geosphere and biosphere, with minerals acting as roles as reactants and catalysts, as templates, as scaffolds to build the molecules of life. And so this coevolution has been a theme for probably the last 4 billion years of Earth's history. Stage 6, that earliest period, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. Microbes basically lived on rock surfaces and took their chemical energy. Not a whole lot of new mineral species, but a lot of new deposits of minerals in the form of iron formations and carbonates and phosphates and so forth. Stage 7, that's what we would call the punctuation event. You oxygenate the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Thousands of new minerals come into play. And these are really the beautiful minerals that you'll find in mineral museums. About 2/3 of all the copper minerals are these blue and green beautiful phases. About 90% of all the uranium minerals and hundreds of other minerals are what are called redox sensitive to oxygen minerals. And so this diversity of minerals would not have occurred on Earth without life first producing oxygen. There was about a billion-year period when the oceans became increasingly oxygenated, but not much else was happening in terms of the change in mineralogy. Some people have called this the boring billion, but it really wasn't that boring. There's a lot of interesting geology that took place during that period of the Proterozoic eon. And then the snowball Earth, this is a period just before the expansion of life into multicellularity and life on land, in which the main mineral on Earth was ice. And at some points, ice was almost present continuously from the poles to the equator. That would have been by far the dominant mineral. But then there were alternate hothouse events. The cycle of climates, because of changes in the carbon in the atmosphere, went from highs to lows. And in fact, there may have been periods of time when ice went completely extinct on Earth, only to come back again. And then stage 10, the Phanerozoic biomineralization, when life crept onto land, when multicellular organisms began to appear, when plants and animals developed new kinds of mineralizing abilities. And so there are all sorts of biominerals that are associated with this. This gets up to us about the 6,000 minerals, and a really amazing period of time. And just as an aside, I have to tell you a story about just one tiny aspect of this amazing period of biomineralization. I love trilobites. I've collected trilobites since I was a little kid, and I've always been fascinated by their eyes. And when you look at one of these trilobite eyes, what you're looking at is single crystals of the mineral calcium carbonate, a carbon-bearing mineral which forms tiny little lenses. Now, that mineral calcite turns out to be a terrible idea for a lens, because red and blue light bend differently, called chromatic aberration. So things are never in focus with a calcite lens. But evolution always finds a way to make things work. It selects for function, a theme I will come back to again and again in this talk. And when you select for function in this case, you can change the calcium carbonate by adding a little bit of magnesium. And when you add magnesium, you change the way light bends. But you can't do it uniformly. You have to zone. So if you think of one of those eyes, if you go from the middle radiating outward, there's a systematic change in the ratio of calcium to magnesium that exactly corrects for chromatic aberration. An astonishing example of how evolution always leads to a result that has function. So that's the trilobite eye. Love them. Go to a museum and see some trilobites sometime. And when you look at those eyes, think about how evolution works. So what have we learned from this first stage of mineral evolution? First of all, we see that Earth's near-surface mineralogy is diversified dramatically. We see all sorts of new mineral-forming processes coming into play. We see that biology has been a major factor in life's diversification and its distribution. We also have seen, and this was something I sort of didn't expect when we published that paper in 2008, this is an incredible way to educate and engage people in the field of mineralogy. Back when I was a child, 10 years old, 12 years old, my family moved to the New York City area. We went to the American Museum of Natural History many, many times, and I would spend most of my time not with the dinosaurs or the dioramas, which were famous, but in the hall of minerals, row after row of specimens listed by their chemical composition and their crystal structure. You get a locality label, but it wouldn't tell you anything about how old the minerals were or what their stories were. And just a couple of years ago, George Harlow redid the entire American Museum collection, and it's now a hall of mineral evolution. The same minerals that I saw when I was a child in the old Dana system now are displayed in the evolutionary system. And it's profoundly moving to me to see that. And this is not just there. Around the world, Vienna and Paris, the new Tucson Gem and Mineral Museum, many people are using this as a way to teach and engage people because minerals tell a story. There's a narrative arc. Every mineral is a time capsule, just waiting to tell its story because it's so information rich. And this was a problem. The original mineral evolution story was very qualitative. And we needed to make it more quantitative if we're going to have a true science of mineral evolution. And so we had to harness deep time data. So the way this is part two, this is about a decade of work starting in 2010, working with my colleague Bob Downs at the University of Arizona. We built on his rough platform. This is the platform that lists all the IMA approved mineral species. You can go there and you can check the different minerals and their compositions and so forth. But we added a mineral evolution database to this, 200,000 records of minerals, their locality, and their ages. And this allows us to do science in deep time on minerals. So for example, we can have a plot like this, and what you're seeing here is a graph that shows on the horizontal axis age back to 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion, 1 billion years. On the vertical scale, how many different mineral locality pairs are in that particular bin. So this, for example, is the evolution of manganese minerals done by my colleague Dan Hummer at Southern Illinois. Here you see two features that we see over and over again in the history of mineralogy on Earth. One is the episodicity. You see very strong pulses in mineralogy associated with supercontinent assembly. When continents come together, when mountains are formed, minerals are also formed at the same time, and they're preserved. The other thing you see here is a change in the oxidation state, that you see a great increase in the average oxidation state because the atmosphere is becoming more oxygen rich. And so we see that also in these kinds of plots. And we do various kinds of data analysis. This is a whole series of different elements, each one shown in the same way that you just saw. So there's a vast amount of information embedded in this. We can also plot the occurrences of these different minerals on ancient plate reconstructions. So working with our colleagues in Australia at the University of Sydney, the G-Plates group, we can now do something like this. So you're looking about 350 million years ago to the modern time here. All those dots are manganese mineral formation. Virtually every time a manganese mineral comes into occurrence, it's near a plate boundary, and the colors once again indicate the change in the oxidation state of those minerals. Again, vast amounts of information that we can now compile thanks to the quantitative approach to mineral evolution. So what we've learned from the mineral evolution database is that minerals display striking episodicity in age based on the supercontinent cycle, that redox-sensitive elements very much change through time, especially because of the increased oxygenation of the atmosphere. And so these are important findings, but again, the MED doesn't fully exploit all the data that we can use. And so I'm going to go to part 3, mineral informatics, the idea that minerals contain immense amounts of information. Every specimen you can hold in your hand has dozens and dozens of different chemical variations, all the different trace and minor elements as well as the major elements, hundreds of different isotopic variations that we have. That's an astonishing amount of information available there. There's different solid and fluid inclusions, there's different morphology, there's the physical properties, there's the context. Minerals are information rich. So part 3 is something we started in 2019 and we're working on very hard for the last few years. Use all different kinds of data resources in order to understand minerals. And just to give you a real glimpse of the kinds of exciting ways we can apply these data. This, for example, is something called a chord diagram. Here you're seeing just coexistences of cobalt minerals. Cobalt's a vital resource. Here we, for the first time, are able to see in one image all the different ways that cobalt minerals coexist with each other, and there are patterns here that were unexpected regarding the relationships of cobalt, nickel, arsenic, and sulfur. We can also use network diagrams. This just shows coexistence of different minerals, in this case, igneous minerals. So what we're looking at here is a network of coexisting minerals. For example, in granite, you have a group of coexisting minerals, and you can show that as a subgraph on this larger plot. And we can look at different rock types. And indeed, on a simple little network diagram like this, all of igneous petrology is represented. Every rock type you've ever studied in an igneous mineral class is presented. So we can do this kind of thing. So we can do this in 3 dimensions. Here's Dan Hummer's 3-dimensional map of manganese coexistence. You see 3 different nodes. This was a real surprise to us that there's 3 different populations of manganese minerals. You can probe this in different dimensions. For example, this is a 3-dimensional rendering where we can zoom in and we can look at each of those different nodes and say how it's linked. You can spend hours with this if you're interested in manganese minerals. And what's more, you can do this in virtual reality. So you can actually set this up and walk into a 3-dimensional network. You can essentially touch on different nodes and see what's hooked up to what, and just immerse yourself in this 3-dimensional world of mineral coexistence. So this is one of the key ideas I want to get across, that this is a new era of Earth materials research, an informatics era where we're looking at large data resources and we can develop new insights and understanding because minerals themselves are a multidimensional system. We don't use XY plots anymore. We're thinking in higher dimensions. So, for that reason, we've proposed a new classification system. And it's a classification system of minerals that's quite different from the one I showed you before. So why do you have a classification system? One is just to communicate. You need to be able to say, this is quartz, this is calcite. You also need to be able to articulate and explore theories. And the ideal IMA system, which looks at idealized structure and idealized composition, it led to things like the periodic table of the elements and the discovery of X-ray diffraction and the rules of chemical bonding has been incredibly important. But if you're interested in deep Earth history, how planets evolve, how life emerged, you need something where you have the dimension of time. So you can have multiple valid classification systems, and we're proposing a different classification system than the IMA one that's based on the concept of time in mineralogy. So think about this. The primary tangible evidence we have for the earliest processes in our solar system, and even going older than that, back to the origin and the evolution of stars, are these rocks and minerals as the only things that you can hold in your hand or you can study that are preserved from that ancient time. So we have an evolutionary system. 7 parts have now been published. There are 5 more to go. Part 8 is in review and revision. Part 9 is in preparation. There'll be 3 more after that, and then that's the evolutionary system. And what we do is we approach the classification of minerals in a slightly different way. Remember, IMA, naturally occurring, ideal composition, ideal structure. We say, no, let's use all the data we can possibly use. And when you start doing that, then sometimes you have to split the IMA species into subkinds. Sometimes you have to lump IMA species into a single kind, and we also classify amorphous materials, glassy materials, that are not part of the IMA system because they don't have a crystal structure, at least in the traditional sense. So let me just give you an example. Diamond. Diamond to IMA is pure carbon in the idealized diamond crystal structure. What we say is, yeah, that's great, but look at the different kinds of diamonds. You have stellar diamonds that formed before our solar system around distant stars that were carbon rich. Tiny, tiny particles. You have type 1 diamonds which form deep in the mantle in an aqueous fluid saturated with carbon. You have type 2 diamonds which formed deep in the mantle but in a metal fluid saturated with carbon. You have impact diamonds. That's carbon that was subjected to extreme high pressures and temperatures of an impact. And then there's this stuff called carbonado, which is a kind of a sintered diamond, and absolutely nobody knows for sure what it is. These are different kinds of diamond. They're extremely different. And so we give them different names within our classification system because the formation process is important. Pyrite's the world record so far that we found 21 different modes of formation of pyrite. Each one is a different kind of pyrite. So some form at high temperature, some at low temperature, some in an aqueous fluid, some in a sulfur-rich fluid. Some of them are non-biological, but some of them are formed by microbes. And so if we found pyrite on Mars, for example, the first thing you should ask, well, what kind of pyrite? And that's what we're trying to do. Now, in other cases, we lump. Tourmaline, there's 37 different species now approved of tourmaline minerals. They all have the same structure, but they have slightly different compositions. And in one of these beautiful crystals from Madagascar, I recently heard a talk at the GSA meeting that there can be as many as 8 different official IMA species in a single crystal. Well, we say no, they're all formed in the same time, the same place, in the same process. We're going to call that one natural kind, and we're going to lump those species together. So that's lumping. And then we also take things like obsidian, volcanic glass, or coal, things that have been traditionally part of mineralogy, limonite and pyrolusite, fine-grained mixtures that often don't have good X-ray patterns. And those are all considered by us. They were considered by Dana 150 years ago, but then dropped because they don't have good X-ray patterns. But we think they're important, especially if you look at Mars, the surface of Mars. The sediments of Mars can be as much as 70% amorphous materials. So when you see reports of the mineralogy of Mars, you're seeing reports of what typically are 50 or 40%, sometimes only 30% of the volume of the sediments, and all the rest of the stuff is an amorphous material, which is really important to understanding Mars and how it behaved. How we approach this is a paper that I wrote during the COVID isolation. This took about 6 months to compile a list of all the 5,700 minerals known at that time and every known process by which they form. This is called the paragenetic modes. And so if you look at this in detail, it's this incredible table with 5,700 rows and 57 columns, and there's ones and blanks. And that means, a one means that that mineral forms in that particular paragenetic mode. And this allowed us a new way of approaching mineralogy. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, those minerals, the stellar minerals, and you'll see that we have a binomial nomenclature. Here, for example, it's graphite. That's an IMA species, but it's an SN2 graphite. SN2 is a supernova type 2. So this is graphite formed in a supernova. Here's moissanite, that's silicon carbide, formed in an AGB star. And so we can make a network. This is called a bipartite network. And what you see here are two different kinds of nodes showing what's minerals formed by what processes. You have type 2 supernova is one of the stellar nodes, and there's an AGB star there. And you'll see that every one of these star-shaped nodes, each a different kind of star, is linked to one or more kinds of minerals. There's moissanite, there's graphite. And so we now have a map, a network diagram, which shows all the stellar minerals and all the different ways they form. We can expand this to the solar nebula, where you have the earliest nebular condensates. We can add interstellar clouds and some of the very cold ices that form. We can expand to all the other meteorite minerals. I told you about 300 of these. Each time we're just adding to the network. We're making it bigger and bigger as we have more processes and more mineral species come into play. Part 6 was our imagining of the earliest Hadean mineralogy. Some of the minerals in red are found in the meteorites. Some of them in green are things we think were found on Earth but not in meteorites. And in yellow are ones that are found in both. And so you see this just keeps growing larger and larger. By the way, that little circle there, that's where the original stellar network is. It still is in there, but you see you just keep expanding and moving outward. And we think this, by the way, is probably similar to the network of minerals on Mars. And then just jumping fast forward, this is the 5,700 minerals and the 57 different ways that they form. So this is a graph of all mineralogy. This is a visual representation that's interactive. You can go in, you can click on any one of the nodes, either the 57 nodes representing a process or the 5,700 nodes representing minerals, and you can see what's connected with what. There's just a vast amount of information, and this is ripe for exploration. We've been doing some of that. Let me give you some of the highlights of that exploration. First, and I think this was a real surprise to us in a sense, water is by far the most important factor in diversification of minerals on Earth. 90% of the minerals on Earth, either directly or indirectly, result from water-rock interactions. And that's why a planet like Earth can be so diverse mineralogically compared to, say, the Moon or Mercury, or even Mars, which has a much more limited hydrologic cycle. A second idea, and I think this is just utterly fascinating. There are 41 rare chemical elements in Earth's crust. Collectively, those 41 elements represent only 1 in every 10,000 atoms. That's like 1/100th of 1% of all the atoms. And yet they are essential elements in 42% of all the mineral species. If you don't have that 1/100th of 1%, you can't make 42% of the minerals that we see on Earth. So it's an astonishingly important role of rare elements. I think this partly has to do with water-rock interactions again as well, because the only way you concentrate those rare elements like lithium and rare earth elements and arsenic and molybdenum is through water-rock interactions and the way the fluids can select and concentrate. But that's one of the things. And biology plays this huge role, this outsized role. 50% of all species can be mediated by biology, and more than a third are exclusively biotic. So those are some of our main findings. There's one other thing that we're exploring, and that's that the structure of this network, you can do network statistics, and the size and the shape of this network, the way it's laid out, is quite different from the network of the minerals of any other world, the Moon, Mercury, Mars, the Vesta meteorites that we find. And we wonder whether this isn't a biosignature, because the network dynamics that we see here are actually very similar to the networks of various food webs and metabolic pathways. We think there may be an imprint of biology on this network. So the conclusion of all this about mineral evolution is that Earth's mineralogy has evolved. It's a 4.5 billion year process of complexification, of selection and concentration of elements, and there's new physical, chemical, and biological processes at play. Now, I want you all to take a deep breath, because I'm going to make a leap here, which may be a little audacious, but it's also very, very exciting to us. 3 weeks ago, in the Proceedings of the National Academy, we published a paper suggesting there's a missing law of nature relating to evolving systems. And the mineral evolution work is what led us to this idea. So what do I mean by this? Let's take a step back. There are some laws of nature, about a dozen statements in all, which explain everything we experience in our lives in the physical, chemical universe. These are called macroscopic laws. I'm not talking about the theory of relativity. I'm not talking about quantum mechanics here. I'm talking about the basic things, the laws of motion, of gravity, electromagnetism, and energy. And collectively, these laws are supposedly codifying what we experience in the physical world. And the question we asked ourselves is, are these laws of nature sufficient to characterize all the different things that we see around us all the time? And I'm going to suggest the answer is no. So about 2 years ago, we started a missing law group. I worked with my colleague Mike Wong, who's just a brilliant young scholar from Caltech. And we immediately hit it off. We started talking about missing laws, and then we started adding people saying, you know, the two of us can't figure this out alone. So Anirudh Prabhu from Carnegie is a data scientist. Jim Cleaves is a origin of life expert. Stanley Miller's last graduate student, by the way, if you remember the Miller-Urey experiment. Carol Cleland, Daniel Ahrens, and Heather Demarest are philosophers of natural law at the University of Colorado Boulder. Stuart Bartlett's a theoretical physicist at Caltech. Jonathan Lenine, an astrobiologist at Cornell. And together, we said, what's a missing law? And it's going to have to be something that describes something we all experience all the time. It's nothing subtle. It's something that's going to be really obvious and staring us in the face. Second thing, it has to be fully consistent with all the other laws of nature. We're not overturning any of those other well-established statements. But it cannot follow inevitably from those other laws. It has to be something different. And what might that be? Okay, here are the laws of nature so far. There's 3 laws of motion. There's a law of gravity, laws of electromagnetism, 4 statements of Maxwell's equations, and 2 main laws of thermodynamics. And discovery of each of these laws, if you're going to find a natural law, you're likely to begin by recognizing something in nature that I call a conceptual equivalent, something that people hadn't recognized before. So let's give examples of this. Isaac Newton, before he could formulate the laws of motion, he had to make an intellectual breakthrough. That was recognizing 2 kinds of motion, one of which is called uniform motion, things sitting still on a table or moving in this constant direction at a constant speed. That's uniform motion. And everything else he realized, including perfect circular motion at a constant speed, everything else is acceleration. And once he recognized that, which previous scholars had not, he was able to say 3 laws. First law, changes in motion require a force. Here he's defining a force. Second law, force equals mass times acceleration. Here he's defining mass. So these are really fundamental ideas. And third, forces always act in pairs. Every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Newton was then able to articulate one of those forces by recognizing another conceptual equivalence, that an apple falling from a tree is conceptually equivalent to the moon orbiting Earth. Both are falling. Previous scholars hadn't recognized that. In fact, they thought the moon was in uniform motion, and you can see how that would mislead you. So he was able to come up with the law of gravity. Now, an obvious one, electromagnetism, the 2 very different forces of static electricity and magnetic attraction were unified into the laws of electromagnetism, especially when Ørsted showed that an electric moving current could create an electromagnet, and this led to the various laws of electromagnetism codified in Maxwell's equation, It led to the electric motor and electromagnets and electric generator, but also the prediction of light, which is why light is not one of the laws of nature. The definition or the explanation of light doesn't require a separate law. It falls mathematically out of the laws of electromagnetism. And then finally, the laws of energy. And this was the last of the group to be identified. And that's because it's conceptual equivalents of very, very different things. There's potential energy, there's kinetic energy, and then there's heat. And until you recognize that these were three aspects of the same phenomenon, energy, you could not make any progress. But once you did, you could have Joule's famous experiment showing the transition of one kind of energy to another, gravitational potential, to kinetic energy of a moving paddle wheel, to the thermal energy of the water that gets heated up in the process. That's the first law. And then the second law is that heat does not spontaneously flow from a colder to a warmer body. That second law is the only one of these that has an arrow of time. And that's it, unless you want to add the conservation of energy and the conservation of mass and so forth. But those are details, about a dozen statements in all. There they are. And the question is that it? And I'm going to argue passionately that no, it isn't. There's something missing. Because nothing in these laws explicitly or implicitly predicts the origin and evolution of life, or in fact the evolution of any system. I'm going to say that the conceptual equivalence we're looking at is all around us all the time, and it has to do with all different kinds of evolving systems, both living and non-living systems. Stars evolve, minerals evolve, planets evolve, life evolves. And on beyond that, many things that we experience in society and culture evolve. So when I say evolution, I mean two specific things. It diversifies through time. The system becomes more patterned, more complex, more interesting, if you will, and it's a congruent set that each step of that evolution process follows one after another. Those are important ideas for evolution. Now, the thing is, these different systems and many, many others are conceptual equivalent in three essential ways. So, first of all, these systems have the potential to adopt many, many different configurations because they're made of small particles. Nucleons or atoms or molecules or cells or people that can arrange themselves in vast numbers of different combinations. That's the first criteria. The second is there has to be a natural process that generates many of those different configurations. You're not going to evolve unless you actually are sampling many possibilities. And third, there has to be a selection for function. The system has to do something better than the things around it to make it persist, to make it survive, to make it evolve. And if you have these three characteristics, whether we're talking about atoms or molecules or cells or any other collection of interacting particles, then evolution can occur. I'm just going to very quickly show you three examples that you're probably familiar with. First is nucleosynthesis. You start with protons and neutrons after the Big Bang. The very first elements that are formed are primarily hydrogen and helium with a little bit of lithium thrown in. You then have the first generation of stars, where nuclear fusion in the stars creates all the carbon and many other elements, but only a handful compared to what we have now. So this is the dozen or so elements that are created in abundance in that first generation of stars. But this generation of stars feeds the next generation of stars, where you can have the R process, which gives you a few dozen different elements, and then the next generation of stars gives you the complete range of roughly 90 stable chemical elements and about 2,000 different isotopes that we see today. So this is the process of evolution, diversification. You have protons and neutrons that can be rearranged in many, many different configurations. The stars sample those configurations. You select the things that are stable. Mineral evolution I've just shown you. You start with very, very simple groups of just 12 elements, 20 minerals. We now have 6,000 minerals and 72 different elements. You keep creating new environments, new niches. You mix up elements in new ways, and you get an evolving system. And we can actually show that quantitatively with various metrics of complexity that show that the system becomes more diverse and more complex with time. And then, of course, there's life. And think about what Charles Darwin said in his Origins of Species. This is kind of an echo of the three principles I just told you. Individuals in a population display variation in traits. There's lots of different possible arrangements of genes, for example. More individuals are born than survive. You create lots and lots of combinations out there, but only some of them survive because you're selecting for favorable traits. So this is just one example of a much more general phenomenon. By the way, Darwin, a lot of his inferences came from the study of these finches, which is a very small subset of all the different kinds of evolving things that happen in life. But it's a great example of the principle of conceptual equivalence I'm talking about. And without going into a huge amount of details, you can mimic this process in computers. For example, this from 30 years ago, Nielsen and Pilger made a computer simulation of eye evolution. And many people challenge Darwin and say, what is the use of half an eye? How can an eye possibly evolve from a non-seeing being? And Darwin was puzzled by that. He admitted this was a challenge. But if you assume that you have a flat part of an animal, like a worm, an insect, that there are a few light-sensitive cells, and many different kinds of cells in nature are light-sensitive, this is not an unusual thing, and that you have a substrate built with this arrangement. So what he said, there's three different variables here. One is the curvature of this flat surface. It starts flat, but it can curve outward or inward. You have an aperture from there to there, and you have a refractive index of this clear. That means you can bend light. And then this black thing is the substrate, and the gray thing is the light-sensitive cells. And let's just vary these three parameters by plus or minus 1% randomly. And if you increase visual acuity at all, then you preserve that change, and you then vary that new variant. And the idea here is that even a slight increase in ability to sense light may confer an advantage. If you're a worm and you can tell the direction that a shadow is coming from as opposed to just a flat surface, that's going to help you tell if there's a predator or maybe food supply coming along. So they did this, they varied this, and after 176 steps you get a slight pit. After 1,000 steps, you get an almost perfect circular opening. This is just varying by plus or minus 1% randomly, but selecting for function. That's just the first 1,000 steps. And then remember I said you can change the refractive index, the way light bends. Then you start spontaneously building a lens in this system. You start having an aperture that closes down. And in about 2,000 steps, anytime you start this simulation, you always end up with the mathematically perfect eye given these constraints. So you're selecting step by step for function, and you wind up with something that is much, much enhanced function. And just to give you one other example, go into the literature and look up genetic algorithms, the way they design ship hulls these days or airplanes. And my favorite is the NASA space antenna. Anybody ever hear of the NASA space antenna? This crazy thing? This was designed by a computer-generated algorithm. They wanted to have an antenna that with the least amount of energy would radiate the most amount of information because spacecraft are far away and they don't have a whole lot of power. And so you start with a straight antenna, just a metal bar, and you just start bending it and kinking it in silico. That is, you have the computer. And because they understand how antennas work so intensely, you can say for each antenna design, what's the function, and you can keep improving it. And this is the thing they ended up with. And you cannot improve on this design of an antenna for a spacecraft. That was done entirely through, you have lots of different configurations, you generate lots of configurations, you select for function. And evolution happens. We see it over and over. So remember, these systems have the potential to adopt lots of configurations. There are processes to generate configurations, and you select for function. And when that happens, things evolve. So you can ask the question, well, what are functions? What are we selecting for? And the most basic thing is you just don't fall apart. You don't evaporate. You don't disappear. You're stable. And so a rock that persists is the one we're going to see. And maybe that just seems like a trivial example. We also have dynamic systems that persist. Stars are dynamic systems, hurricanes, forest fires, all sorts of natural systems, even even living things, there are cells that are dynamic, but they persist. And you select for configurations that will allow you to persist as opposed to dissipate or stop working. And finally, we think one of the most important functions is novelty generation. Not for the sake of novelty, but when you generate novelty, it allows you to explore new configuration space that never existed before. And that allows you to do things that your competitors cannot do. So, if you can suddenly see when your competitors can't see, if you can fly, if you can swim, if you can walk, those are all novelties that arise out of new configurations that allow you to do things that will allow you to persist, and in the case of life, reproduce. We think there's a metric for this, and it's not entropy, it's not energy. It has to do with information, because each time you select for function, the information of the system that comes out of there is more and more selected as well. So there is a metric that Jack Shostak and I introduced about 20 years ago. We didn't really know where it was going to go back then, but the idea is simply that you have many configurations. Imagine just an astronomical number of configurations. Only a small fraction of those configurations actually do something useful. So that tiny fraction, you just take the negative log to the base 2 of that fraction, and that's the number of bits of information, functional information in this case, in this system. And our argument is, our law that we're proposing is that the functional information of a system will increase, that is, the system will evolve, if many different configurations of the system undergo selection for one or more function. We think this is a universal statement about how systems evolve, be they atoms and isotopes, be they minerals, be they atmospheres, be they river meanders, be it life. So we suggest that this is a new predictive law, and it's going to be a key step in understanding the behavior of all evolving systems. And I want to emphasize that because this is quantitative, it's not just a kind of vague nebulous statement. We make specific predictions. In origin of life research, people are trying to get chemical systems to evolve in the test tube. Well, how do you do that? You increase the variety of interacting molecules. That's the one. Or you can increase the number of different configurations of those particles. Or you can increase the selective pressure, that is, going through cycles of heating and cooling, wetting and drying, and so forth, light and dark. And so all three of these now are being used routinely in origin of life experiments. We think that this generalization applies to all sorts of evolving systems, stars, minerals, planets, life, maybe to languages. Maybe it applies to the evolution of science itself, knowledge, and other aspects of society where we try different configurations of words or sounds or syllables, and some of them work and some of them don't. You select for those things that work. So that's why we are suggesting, we're proposing, we're hypothesizing that this idea has, at least deserves to be considered as a new law of nature, a law of evolution. And so we put it out there, published 3 weeks ago. So far, the feedback has been very positive, but we're waiting for the people who have looked at it and scratched their head in there. So it's got to be tested in the circles of science, just like everything else. And that's one of the most fun things of science. You come up with ideas, you put them out there, and whatever happens, at least people are thinking and talking about it. So with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our different funders, and I do hope that there's time for a few questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, if I can take the liberty of asking the first question, maybe also try and get to carbon. As you know, this is an area of interest for me with my previous book, Earthly Order, where I tried to explore also functionality of the laws of nature for sustainability, for more applied interest there. I'm wondering that, you said that information is missing from the entropy approach there, but there is the Claude Shannon and all that kind of information entropy, and I'm wondering how this fits into that. And then there's the second aspect of it is that it's very clear that just random mutations could never have led to complex life. They're mathematically impossible to be done, and there's always been this proposition of like fitness landscapes, or Stuart Kaufman's work and others. So I see this as somewhat explaining that, perhaps, that kind of what has been done by people like Kaufman.
Yeah.
And if you can maybe clarify whether that's the case. And then the second part of my question, which is perhaps more provocative, is around, whenever you bring in functionality, there's always the fear that this may get made into a theological argument. And, I had this debate with this chap, Stephen Myers, who's written on, he's sort of an intelligent design guy, and he's written this book called The Return of the God Hypothesis, which is basically about using science to ostensibly say that we cannot explain complexity without having some kind of other aspect. And I'm wondering, like how are you kind of navigating that space? Because I didn't hear any theological argument in this, of course, but I'm sure this could, and you've got John Templeton, because Templeton, of course, is very much, and they are our neighbors in Philadelphia. I have no problem with them at all. I think it's really great that we're exploring these aspects, but just to throw that out.
So many things to say here. First of all, Stuart Kaufman was one of the, he no longer remained anonymous. He was one of the reviewers of the paper. And he said he's been waiting 50 years for this. He said that this explains, because what's slightly different here from what's come before, you alluded to it about using entropy and information and the Shannon sense and so forth, is a very strong feeling amongst some people that all you need is the second law of thermodynamics. That because you're leading to higher entropic states always, that a very fast path to that is to create systems that dissipate energy as fast as possible. And your brain does this incredibly well. So one of the arguments would be Ilya Prigogine, for example, who's a Nobel Prize winner. He worked on non-equilibrium thermodynamics, a really smart person. He wrote books on this. And he suggested that all the evolution of life, including all the evolution of our brain, is merely a way to dissipate energy into the cosmos more rapidly. So, very provocative idea. We find it, I've read his works, I just cannot subscribe to it. I find there's no mechanistic aspect, there's no physical process within Prigogine's arguments that would say how you go from a non-living to a living to a multicellular and we're saying there is a physical, it's an absolute physical process. You can mimic it with computers, you can show exactly how it works, you can measure how much information is involved and transferred in this. One of our counter arguments to him is that the second law, if you read it literally, says you start with the Big Bang at an extremely low entropy state, almost zero entropy, because everything's homogeneous, everything's exactly the same. And that the process of the cosmos is to go from this very, very low entropy state at the beginning, at the end, to a system of the highest possible entropy, randomness, dispersion. Perhaps through the formation of black holes, everything gets sucked into a black hole, and the black holes themselves evaporate, and then you're at the high entropy state. The second law says nothing about how you get from this state to this state. There's nothing in the second law that argues you need to have dissipative systems or you need to do this. What we're saying is the reason that you need another law is because there is a process that we see all around us outside. Look at this room. Look at the people in this. Look at the way you've learned through your life. Go outside and see things that have evolved and sort of this wondrous natural world that has all of these ordered systems. And that there is a rigorous mechanistic process that does that. And it has to do with transfer of information. It's not Shannon information. Shannon developed his ideas of information about information loss as you communicate, as you transfer information from one system. And that certainly is in play here. But functional information increases because you're selecting state after state after state after state that's more functional and therefore represents a smaller and smaller fraction of all possible configurations. Now, so that says nothing about purpose, meaning, teleology, which you refer to. I just turned 75, and I find that this interface is becoming more and more kind of poignant to me. I see two facets of the natural world. I see a natural world in which there are destructive tendencies at every level. There's loss, there's sorrow, there's pain, there's suffering. And that's all really consistent with the second law of thermodynamics, which is a really unhappy law. I mean, let's face it. But I see the other side of nature too, and I see birth and growth and development. I see this exuberance of life, but also exuberance of minerals, the exuberance of atoms and isotopes. I mean, just the richness, the abundance. The universe didn't have to do that, but our universe does that. And so there is an arrow of time which isn't all destruction and loss and sadness. Now, is that purely a scientific statement that I'm making? Or is there something teleological there? Should there be? Should there not be? Should we be scared of that as scientists? Should we be agnostic? Probably. But one of the things we have talked about over and over again, especially because we have philosophers involved in this, is will this idea be misconstrued? Will people take it in directions that we don't want? Remember, when Darwin issued his book on Origin of Species, he had waited 20 years to publish that, and he knew there'd be trouble. And then there were things like social Darwinism and other misuses of his ideas, things he never intended. And I think this idea, because it so mirrors Darwin, but just expands it to a wider sphere of cosmic process, has a tremendous possibility of being misconstrued or used in a teleological way, arguing that there's meaning and purpose in the cosmos, that our universe is special. And I just don't know how to address that. All I can do is say I think there's a mechanistic process that we can see at work all around us, all the time. You can describe it to a 10-year-old, and the 10-year-old will understand what you're saying. And since philosophers have and theologians have for millennia talked about good and evil, and the yin and the yang, the two sides that we experience to life, part of me just says the natural laws should reflect what we experience in a physical world. If we experience these two sides of things, there should be laws that reflect that in some very fundamental way, because that's part of our physical experience and part of our physical existence. That was too long an answer, but it's a very complicated question.
Thank you so much. Other questions, comments? Yes, Manan.
Hi, I'm a second year PhD student. My name is Manan, and really great presentation. I'm mentally feeling very happy with so many amazing facts you laid out. My question is that the need of the four natural laws in the first place came out of people trying to understand why things exist in a certain way around us, and then the definition of natural law also changed as more laws got added into that list of four. Now, I ask that with the hypothesized law of your work, does the definition of what a natural law means changes to a certain degree? And what do you feel about that?
Yeah. So if you didn't hear, the question was, does the proposing of this new natural law change the definition of natural law? And that's something we absolutely do not want to do. What we're saying is that our law is valid only if it is consistent with all the other laws, but it doesn't follow from all the other laws. In other words, you're not going to have a natural law of light because it follows directly from Maxwell's equations. So you don't need a law for light. And if the Prigogine hypothesis is true, that evolving systems merely follow from the second law of thermodynamics because of the dissipation of energy, then you wouldn't need this law. But we disagree. We say, no, the second law doesn't tell you that you have to follow a certain path to get to the end point. And so I think this is fully consistent with the other natural laws. It's in the spirit of the other natural laws. What we're saying, virtually all the natural laws introduced a new natural parameter, like mass or energy, or a coulomb, which is an electric charge, something like that. So all the natural laws introduced a new parameter. We're saying functional information is equally important to energy, that there are laws of information which are different from and every bit as important as laws of energy. They're different phenomena. They have different metrics. They play different roles, but they're completely internally consistent with each other because they have to be. So that's the trick. Once you already have these 12 statements, the 13th statement better be fully consistent with everything else. And one of the things that fooled people is that evolving systems do follow the second law of thermodynamics. They have to. That's a rule. And so if they follow the second law, that doesn't mean they're predicted by or somehow folded into that second law. But the second law has to be present all the time, as do all the other laws. So this is where it's tricky. But we're not redefining what a natural law. In fact, Heather Demarest is one of the world's leading authorities on the philosophy of natural law. And it was just fascinating to work with her and watch her sort out her feelings about this complicated subject.
Yeah, I'm reaching back to my days taking PChem 40 years ago. But in your slide where you had the evolution, I believe, of stars, I remember my professor saying something, everything in the universe is trending toward iron, the middle molecular weight. And I noticed you had iron peaks in each one of these as you increased in your evolutionary. So things are, in some ways, evolving back to something more homogeneous. So does that fit into your model in that you are getting more complexity, more different elements with each generation, but you have this peak of the amount of mass in the universe that's represented by it?
There's two requirements in the universe for this idea to work. And one of the most important is the idea that things are metastable, that not everything reaches this stability. The second idea is you have to have some kind of attractive forces. Imagine a universe where there was no attractive force of gravity, there's no attractive force of electrostatics. You start with this homogeneous Big Bang and just let it go. And in that case, your path from the Big Bang to complete maximum entropy is just, and you're there. There's nothing to hold anything together. There's nothing to make any structure whatsoever. You have no attractive forces. In fact, perhaps you could imagine just having only repulsive forces, where everything is forced as far away from each other as fast as. And that's one possible universe. That's a possible path. So you have to have attractive forces in order to see anything, to have stars with gravity, to have atoms formed together with electrostatics, and the strong force and the weak force that we know about. So, and you also have to be able to make things that are stable under one set of conditions, but then persist. And what you're alluding to is the fact if you look at the energy of all the different atoms and isotopes, the lowest energy state is iron 56. That's the nuclear particle at which no matter how, you can't fuse it, you can't use fission, there's no more energy to be had. It's the lowest. And if our universe went to equilibrium, all the nucleons would form iron 56, and we'd just have a universe in which there was only iron 56. Just like we'd have a universe that only had a few different minerals, and we see 6,000. So part of this is the persistence of states that are not at equilibrium. They're metastably existing. And that includes us. We're really metastable. In other words, if you clicked a button and said, let's let everything go back to equilibrium, we turn into a bunch of CO2 and H2O. I mean, just evaporate. But that doesn't happen. And so that's an essential part of a universe that allows this kind of functional information, selecting ever higher states. Many of those states are going to be functional, but they're going to be metastable states, but they persist because they do a job better than the things around them do. And so it's a kind of funny concept, but we see it all the time. And to me, that's...
Well, and that is actually the part of Prigozhin's work which won him the Nobel Prize to some degree, was the non-equilibrium chemistry.
Absolutely, it's not.
That part he was right on.
Yeah, but I mean, he was a really smart guy. so we're not disagreeing with his non-equilibrium thermodynamics. What we're saying is that's not sufficient to explain how systems evolve. And if you read his books carefully, you always get to this point where everything's logical, and then and then there's this miracle somehow. But it's done with nice words so that it sounds. And I think he was really convinced that he had the whole story there, but we think he didn't.
Yeah, hi, my name's Gwen. I'm a first-year PhD student.
Can you?
Yeah, my name's Gwen. I'm a first-year PhD student. Perhaps this is unintended side effects of how your work might be used, but I'm curious what you think about this kind of being applied to understanding like behaviorals or like social systems. So thinking about evolution, it's not just the longer beak helps me, it's this behavioral pattern is going to help me be more successful, and how this way of thinking could be used to understand like power dynamics and the way we evolve as a species and society, and just kind of that lens of this law.
So Gwen, this is a question that troubles us, because when you start getting very, very complex systems in which there are many different kinds of interaction, this can even be in a cell level, much less a human society level, that we're trying to figure out whether selection occurs locally on a short time scale, and if when you have sufficiently complex systems, selection on a local short time scale actually has long-term detrimental effects, and this is why it's really complex to apply this idea. We can talk about the function of an enzyme really, really well. And we can talk about the stability of a mineral or an isotope really, really well. But when you start talking about a system in which there are many, many interacting functions, and they all have to sort of work, you can't select for just one of them at one time. And the thing about societies, for example, in a democracy, when you have an election and you're selecting for one thing, but that has ripple down impacts on such a much wider range of things that we're not sure our law can be applied in any simple way. Certainly, we couldn't compute that. By the way, the fact you can't compute an exact answer for something in terms of functional information is not a deterrent. For example, you can't calculate the gravitational field of the asteroid belt. You just simply can't. There's no mathematical way to do it. That doesn't mean there isn't a gravitational field. It just means you can't calculate it. So we think that there are implications for societies, but we have not gone that far. Our paper talks only about physical and biological systems at this point, with the speculation that there's maybe language evolution, maybe the evolution of science itself. Where there's a self-correcting selection process that maybe we can start expanding out and explore those areas. And I know other people will. Other people will. There's no question about it. So
I'm wondering if Jeffrey West's work is relevant to that. He wrote this very famous book, Scale. Scale. He tries to do that, to bring it all the way to social systems. But have a look at it. But I think he has a missing link in there too, because the last part of the book, the last chapter is sustainability, and there's a sudden leap, and it's like he's talking about quarks and all. So I think you may be able to help Jeffrey.
Yeah. We're trying to keep it as grounded as possible to begin with, rather than speculate about systems where the functions are not clearly distinguishable and the selection process is a little bit muddy. So, and that's partly because I'm not a sociologist at all, and I respect the people who are, and we'll let them tackle those aspects.
Thank you. Please, you had a question.
mathematical laws have some pretty complex mathematics involved. The rules, there are mathematical rules, as it were. Do you see a pathway towards developing a similar quantitative sense of this law?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the first steps is the paper I'm working on right now. You've seen the 10 stages or the 11 stages of mineral evolution. We can actually calculate, based on the complexity of the chemical formulas and the number of elements involved, what the total configuration space is for atom configurations at each stage of mineral evolution. 0 through 11. And what I want to find out is, does the functional information increase? I mean, I just want to run that calculation. There'll be some approximations, but still, it's a pretty rigorous way to approach it. We could also do the same thing with nucleon through the different stages of star evolution. So that's the first. Jack Shostak and I did, when we looked at the functional information of different RNA strands called aptamers, we took this to another level. But again, we were looking at the function of a specific system to do a specific task. What's going to be more complicated math is what Gwen alluded to. It's just this idea of a system where you have many functions going on simultaneously, some of which may be, at odds with each other, but all of them have to work in some way, and then it becomes a much more complicated. But that's the same problem we have in any system where there's multiple interacting cycles. Feedback loops. If you have lots of feedback loops, the system is just more complicated mathematically. And a lot of smart people have been thinking about that math. And I think maybe the final answer will come also from looking at the evolution of AI and other computational systems, just genetic algorithms, see how they behave, see how they understand. I think that there are some, how rapidly can something evolve? How far can it evolve? What's the maximum level of functional information possible for any given system? All those things are we have pretty good hints about how to go about thinking about them. So that's part of our program now.
One of the recent field medalists in maths, he's tried to work on that. He's an Austrian mathematician. Like how when you mix milk and coffee, like how can you mathematically predict all the different kind of currents there? Yes.
Hey, sorry, because my question is a little bit different from
That's great.
Yeah. Is there a link between symphony in C and the song?
Is there a link
about
between
the book? He's asking about the carbon book. Is there something about carbon that you might want to look from your book, Symphony in C, with this narrative also?
So of all the elements, carbon is the one that shows the greatest evolution. It's the element that shows the greatest diversification through time in terms of, thinking about carbon and the way it starts out just as this isolated atom in a stellar environment very early in Earth history. In fact, some carbon was even formed during the Big Bang, a small amount. About 1 in every trillion carbon atoms in your body is a Big Bang carbon atom. That to me is astonishing. We actually carry with us large numbers of carbon atoms that were formed at the very moment of creation, which is just like, whoa. And then the other 999 billion, 999 million, whatever. The rest of them were formed in later stars. And if you look at what has happened to carbon and the way it's been diversified, and again, in answer to your comment, Gwen, the idea that organic chemistry, which is just the humans accelerating this process of carbon's evolution as a material. Now we have engineered carbon-based molecules and just diversifying in a way. So one could use carbon itself as the ultimate example of a complex evolving system, something that started very, very simple and continues to get every year vastly more complex than it was before. So it's a great example, and thanks for that question.
The book actually has 4 parts. Is there a link between the Symphony of George Bizet and the actual book.
Yeah. So you're referring to the fact that the book Symphony in C has four main parts: earth, air, fire, and water. And there is a funny story behind that. I was the director of this very large project to study carbon in Earth at all different scales, and we ended up at the end of a 10-year program with 1,300 collaborators. We had 55 countries involved. We had hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. We had thousands of papers published, and I was supposed to summarize that in a book. What I told you today was kind of a narrative arc, the idea of minerals starting simply and becoming more complex and going through time. And we talked about other systems, life, the origin and evolution of life as a narrative arc. I hadn't had this perspective of carbon when I wrote the book. I hadn't thought about this missing law when I wrote the book. I wish I had, because if I did, I could use carbon as the narrative arc, how you start with the single atom and then you just get more and more complicated in all these different domains. I wish I had. But at the time, I just thought carbon, it just sort of sat there, and I said I could write a chapter on volcanoes, I could write a chapter on diamonds, I could write a chapter on, I don't know, enzymes, and it would just be like a whole bunch of chapters that didn't have a whole lot of linkage other than that carbon was a word used in all those chapters. And so it just came to me once I could write a book that was more like a symphony, like a musical symphony where there was four different moods, four different characters, and the classic elements, earth, air, fire, and water, that you have these four different ways of looking at carbon. And if you read the book, at least what I tried to do is write each of the chapters with a slightly different meter or tone of words, a slightly different way of arranging things. So more energetic or more relaxed or more. So that was the logic behind doing that. It was to present carbon in its many, many facets in a book form that covered a lot of the information but wasn't trying to be an encyclopedia of carbon. It was rather sort of like a symphony. You have different melodies that emerge, and different parts of the orchestra come out at different times, and it doesn't have to be complete. It is what it is. It's all there, even though it's not everything. But it's everything that's part of that symphony. So, but you made me think now, if I could write the book a second time, I could use a different narrative arc, which is one of emergent evolution, which is a really great concept. Though, too late.
Thank you, Matthew, for
Very provocative question, very thoughtful.
Yes, Nancy, please.
A couple of questions. One is, how do you know that it's like 1/100th, whatever, of
Measuring.
of carbon in this Big Bang, and no more, no less? And the second question is, with all the beauty in all the different minerals, what function, can we differentiate, one mineral from another?
Yeah. So the function of minerals really is to be stable and to persist. But if you look at the pictures of minerals, like this incredible specimen that I have here, which shows that's a cave deposit. It's actually the specimen with teacups on it. That's actually formed upside down. And it formed as the level of the water in the cave changed, and calcium carbonate, a carbon-bearing mineral, precipitated at different levels. But the function of all that was, at the time, to be stable, to persist, to form something that wouldn't just dissolve and go away. And that's why we have, in the Mineral Museum, we have these incredible specimens spanning billions of years, because they formed and they were stable. They didn't just dissolve or evaporate away. So if it may seem trivial, but the idea of persistence being the most fundamental function is true of everything. We persist, whereas other genetic variations of organisms through time, most of them have just vanished, they've disappeared, and some persist, and we see this as this part of the evolving process, is that the functional information, as you get more and more sophisticated, just basically has to increase. And I think that's why you were speaking about teleology, because we're really talking about a quantity in the universe that if you want to ascribe a value to it, more diverse, more interesting, increased functional information, that's something that's not a neutral term. Scientists would generally say every configuration is of equal value. They're all conceptually the same, every possible configuration. And nature is saying, no, there's some configurations that are functional, and therefore we're going to select those and we're going to reject the other ones. You can imagine some combination of protons and neutrons that you say that's every bit as interesting as any other combination of protons and neutrons, but if it doesn't form a stable element, we don't care. And yet, scientifically, it's something you could analyze and study and do theoretical modeling on. So it's tricky territory. Even just saying function, well, what do you mean by function? Which function are you selecting for? Is one function better than another, you know? Is that applying value to science? Is value allowed in science? And
just for the students, you understand teleology is different from theology. Teleology is about purpose, and theology is more important. A lot of
saying that something has function might be construed as saying something has a purpose, that nature has a purpose, that therefore we have purpose, and that might be meaning, and that might mean progress, and it might mean a universe that's going to some point, and you can start layering on these speculations which are uncomfortable to science.
And then the measurement question about how you found the one in a trillion. How do scientists measure?
Okay. That's purely based on a calculation. I can give you the reference. It was published about 6 or 7 years ago by an Italian theoretical physicist. Iocco is his name, and he showed that if you run simulations of all the different kinds of collisions that were occurring during the early moments of the Big Bang, the most abundant things that were forming were just isolated protons, that's hydrogen 1, or a proton and a neutron, that's deuterium, or 2 protons and 1 or 2 neutrons, which are the helium. And that's in most calculations, the rough calculations show that's what comes out with a little bit of lithium, that's the element 3. If you run the simulations longer with more realistic temperatures and pressures, you can show that there also are much higher energy collisions that are occurring in places which lead to the production of some carbon, I believe some oxygen and some nitrogen, small amounts. So it's a calculation. I mean, nobody was there 13.8 billion years ago, but the models that show hydrogen and helium were dominant are very, very closely matched by observations of the cosmos today, which gives a lot of confidence that the models of the formation of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen in very, very small amounts are also valid. So, but it's a calculation. It's not a measurement, and we can't say this carbon atom was from the Big Bang. A carbon 12, that's 6 protons and 6 neutrons. A carbon 12 is a carbon 12 whether it was formed in a star or in the Big Bang or, in a nuclear reactor last week.
Yeah.
They're indistinguishable as far as we know.
And for those of you interested in sort of the history of this work, there's the famous paper B2FH, it's called by the initials of the authors, and it's about the synthesis of elements in stars, it's called. And it starts with 2 quotations from Shakespeare, actually, one from Julius Caesar and the other from the other play in which the stars. But it's a fascinating history of how this whole research came about. And interestingly enough, 3 of the authors of that paper didn't believe in the Big Bang hypothesis. And I talk a little bit about that in soil to foil. But one of the other last maybe question I'd say is, or comment is, like in my soil to foil, it's about aluminum. And
Yes.
one of the puzzles about aluminum is, it's the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, but no life evolved to metabolize aluminum. And it's like, because it's so abundant. First of all, why was it abundant? But that can be explained more so. But then why that has more to do with other electronic configuration and so on. But
It's so strongly in the +3 oxidation state that you can't really oxidize or reduce it in a metabolic cycle, and so you can't pass electrons around. If you can't pass electrons, it's not going to help you. But it certainly is a very important and abundant element, and its isotopes are fascinating too. So much to know.
Any other last minute question? Thank you so much. Wow, there's been
Thank you.
what
Thanks,
a treat.
everybody.
And we do have maybe just to check, is there a comment online? Because we had the online audience.
Oh,
and we
I don't know. I have no idea.
let me just double check, but I think there's just one comment in there. Okay.
Yes. So the comment is, thanks for your interesting talk. I'm curious how anthropogenic induced changes, such as mining and climate change or even lab-grown minerals, might interrupt or even leverage this new law, especially in relation to mineral evolution. And indeed, we think of human actions as being part of an evolutionary process. The synthesis of mineral-like compounds, we call that stage 11, or the Anthropocene is the geological term for the period when human interactions occurred. And we've written papers about Anthropocene minerals and the implications of what will happen, a million or 10 million years down the road when there's a layer of sediments that has all of our human detritus in it. That'll be a geological marker layer for our time. So I do feel that all this has to be folded in. We are part of the evolving system. And this is a time when, because of our engineering skills, we can accelerate the evolution. The selection process still involves imagining new combinations, but if you can imagine the combinations in your head or in a machine, you can go through them much, much more rapidly than you can if you had to synthesize each one individually and then test it. Just like that space antenna. You can evolve a space antenna in a few seconds using a supercomputer, whereas it would take humans, I don't know how many thousands of years to come up with a design that worked as well. So we're just accelerating the process, and this is why applying our law to AI systems, I think, could be extremely important. Can AI systems evolve? How far can they evolve? By what process do they evolve? What's this function that the AI is selecting for, and can you somehow program in something to block certain functions that you do not want in the AI? That all falls right out of our law. So we're not there yet, but that's a question.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much again. And Terry had one last one.
On the space antenna, all I can think of is when I was a kid and we had the black and white TVs with the coat hanger. And we made space antennas.
Yeah, exactly. It looks like that. Who would have thought? But you can go look up the articles about how that was invented. It was actually quite a number of years ago. I think it's 2006 that they designed that. So this process has been around. I mean, so to me, that's one of the demonstrations of how well this works.
Marvelous.
Yeah.
We look forward to following the commentary on this paper, and it's wonderful that beyond the book, you've actually shared very current research that you're undertaking, and I'm looking forward to writing about this further as well.
Oh, great.
So I'll be checking in with you on that. So thanks to all of
everybody.
you for being here.